But I just want to say thank you for joining us. Our session is titled Equitable Literacy Instruction, Ensuring the Science of Reading Works for All Children. And as you know, the science of reading has been the focus of legislation in states across the country in recent years, but it is often misunderstood, and discussions about it can often ignore the importance of considering the varied backgrounds and needs of diverse students. Despite these misunderstandings, the science of reading is truly a good thing, recognized as a foundational body of research that is essential for informing effective instruction to foster children's literacy success. This science helps educators implement teaching strategies to enhance reading skills from an early age. And unfortunately, like we said, the discussions and focus of this important body of information that teachers are now directed to use in their instruction has lacked a focus on the vast diversity in race, nationality, background, and especially language among students in America's classrooms. CGLR's impactful partners at the Children's Literacy Initiative recently published a report appropriately titled Equity and the Science of Reading, which we'll post in a second in the chat, that outlines concerns about how the science is being translated into practice and applied, and suggests instructional techniques that are driven by a focus on supporting educators and building both their literacy content and culturally sustaining practices. Today, we have this excellent opportunity to engage with our partners at the Children's Literacy Initiative to unpack the key assertions and suggestions in their new report. And we're also thrilled to engage with additional experts and researchers who will help us dispel some of the misunderstandings about the science of reading and explore how to ensure that equity and culturally sustaining practices are integrated into implementation and instruction, and what it will take to transform literacy instruction for English language learners and other diverse learners in our classrooms, ensuring that every child, for sure, has the opportunity to succeed. We are confident that you will walk away today with concrete strategies and suggested practices to integrate equity into your own instructional practices or your colleagues' instructional practices, and we'll give you really clear tips that you can take and apply. And so we are super lucky to have a nationally recognized leader in the learning sciences join us as moderator. Lisa Guernsey is director of the Learning Sciences Exchange at New America and is also a senior editor and strategic advisor in the Education Policy Program. And she is also an exceptional recurring moderator for us here at our GLR Learning Tuesdays. So we're super excited to have her leading our discussion today. And now I'm honored to welcome and really briefly introduce our esteemed panelists. So I'm just going to say these really high level details, and then we've already posted the bios in the chat. We'll post them again. So I want to start by saying that unfortunately, Dr. Stephanie M. Currington is the founding director of the Center on Ecology, the Ecology of Early Development at Boston University. Her child came down with some illness today, so she had to stay home, focus on her child, so she's not here with us today, unfortunately. Dr. Diana Green is here. She's the CEO of the Children's Literacy Initiative, where she advances culturally relevant literacy instruction through professional development, empowering educators and students. We also have Erica Holmes-Ware, who is the Chief Program Officer at the Children's Literacy Initiative, and her work is defined by her relentless pursuit of equity, ensuring all students, especially Black and Latinx children, receive the resources, support, and opportunities they deserve. We also have Dr. Anya Hurwitz. She is President and Executive Director of Sobrato Early Academic Language, widely known as SEAL, where she works to create the conditions for public schools to meet the diverse needs of their students' academic and socio-emotional development. And finally, we also have Dr. Sigrid Soto Boykin. She is the Director of Language Justice and Learning Equity and Research Director of Language Justice and Learning Equity and Research, as well as an assistant professor of the Children's Equity Project at Arizona State University. And she has a deep background in bilingual speech language therapy and early literacy instruction. So we welcome all of you. We really look forward to engaging with you and learning from you. And now I'm very excited to turn it over to Lisa to get the conversation going.
Great. Thanks so much, Emily. And it's a lot of fun to be with you all. This is such an important topic. This is really on the minds of so many. And it's exciting to see that there's so much interest across the country. We have attendees who are in state departments of education, who are teachers, who are on the ground in early literacy programs. So thrilled to be with you all. What I'll do, say a couple of minutes of context setting, but I'm really eager to dive into a conversation with Diana and Erica. And I'll just note that what Emily shared at the beginning, I think, is what's on so many people's minds right now, which is that it's really great news that the science of reading has become so top of mind. It is something that we're all trying to much more deeply understand. And this is definitely not a but an and moment. And we have to kind of go a little bit deeper on this and recognize that there can be a lot of misconceptions, misunderstandings, that can be kind of some shortcuts that aren't really based in the science that start to happen. And there was this report that's come out from the Children's Literacy Initiative, really helps to shine a spotlight on what some of those misconceptions may be, and really how to work through them and do what's right for kids, especially those of our youngest learners who in the past have really been underserved and have not gotten what they need at all in the world of literacy and learning. So let me turn it over to you if I could. I want to start with the authors and the folks who have built out this incredible report for us. And so, Diana, if we could just hear a little bit more from you about what spurred this report, and where your concerns lie when it comes to misunderstandings around the science of reading.
Well, thank you, Lisa. Children's Literacy Initiative has been a national nonprofit for over 35 years. And as you know, we've had reading wars for decades. And so often as a nation, we will gravitate to a particular way that instruction should be delivered. And as an organization who's focused on, yes, literacy instruction, we sometimes have to redefine ourselves. And we wanted to make sure that as an organization, we wanted the stamp. We are very much into, and we say, sciences of reading, because it isn't just a one size fits all. It's not a thing called science of reading. It's the sciences of reading. But as an organization who focuses heavily on Black and Brown children, we wanted to make sure that culturally relevant education wasn't left like it's something off to the side. It needs to be infused and ingrained in the sciences of reading. And I'm just so proud to be a part of Children's Literacy Initiative. Our program team, led by Erica Holmes Ware, really led this initiative to say, you know what, we need to put out a white paper and really emphasize the misconceptions about the science of reading, and highlighting how those misconceptions can lead to a very narrow view of educating Black and Brown children, and quite frankly, all children.
Yeah, and I just want to say, I think that's one of the things that when I see all the legislation that's been coming through the states, and this has been over several years now, it's been exciting to see the focus, and also disappointing to see that so few of the pieces of legislation get into that deeper context that you're talking about, Diana, where there's a recognition of our multilingual learners, of just the vast, incredible rich diversity of our students and our littles in terms of what they've experienced when they're coming into this world of learning to read and learning to write. And we'll get into some of that, I think, a little bit later too. So having this kind of webinar to be able to kind of really unpack that a little bit more and help to provide some guidance, I think is very needed right now. I'll also just quickly note, before I have a question for you, Erica, to go a little further on this, but I just wanted to note that one of my colleagues at New America, Leslie Villegas, has been working on this issue as well. And I thank you, Emily, for posting some of that in the chat, where there are some additional resources around what this looks like for English learners in particular, and how we can use the science of reading to make sure that they're well served. But Eric, let me go to you, because the report that the Children's Literacy Initiative put out, not only is it like beautifully laid out, so it's very easy to digest and understand, but there are these places in that report where there's lists of kind of misconceptions. And then there's another column that's like, here's what we really know. from the science. Do you mind telling us a little bit more about those and picking a few of them to unpack for us?
Yeah, absolutely. Lisa, there are several misconceptions about the science of reading that we felt were important to address in this white paper, especially as we're speaking about equity and literacy education. And so one major misconception is that the reading crisis will be solved simply by having all educators follow the science of reading. And the truth actually is that the literacy crisis is far more complex, right? It's multifaceted and historically rooted in issues that continue to create inequitable learning experiences for Black and Latinx children. And simply implementing research-based practices without addressing systemic inequities will not solve the problem. Another misconception is the belief that there is a settled one-size-fits-all science of reading. And in reality, literacy research is broad, deep, and constantly evolving. And we have to approach it with the understanding that children in our classrooms are diverse, each bringing unique cultural and linguistic backgrounds that must be considered in how we teach. Um, there's, of course, also the idea that a lack of strong decoding instruction is the primary reason for the literacy crisis. And while foundational skills like phonics and decoding are essential, learning to read is a complex process. And children do need consistent instruction in these skills as well as, but not at the expense of other critical areas like interactive read alouds and shared text and writing instruction. We believe in a holistic and comprehensive approach. And another that I'll say is incredibly important for our time together today here is addressing these misconceptions is critical, but it also feels really important to highlight that there's this belief that if teachers just follow the script in the curriculum with fidelity, that all children will learn to read. And the reality really is that teaching is both an art and a science. Educators are professionals who need and deserve ongoing professional development that evolves with the research, and they must be empowered to make informed instructional decisions that meet the diverse needs of their children.
Yeah, thanks so much, Erica, for laying those out. And if I could go back to one that is in the report, just to maybe put a real pin in that one, it is that there may be this misunderstanding, as you just said, that all children experience schooling and instruction in the same way, regardless of their race and their language and their culture. And you turn that around in the report. And so tell us a little bit more about that and why it's important to recognize that this is not like a one size fits all.
For sure. The truth to that misconception is that effective literacy practices must actively sustain and respond to children's identities, their languages, their lived experiences. Ignoring these factors actually leads to disengagement and missed opportunities for learning. And interestingly enough, I know that we speak about the sciences of reading and culturally sustaining practices, and it feels really important to note that culturally sustaining practices are also a huge body of research that has been highly prevalent over the last several decades, led by scholars in the field that offer incredible insights to how we support diverse children and diverse learners in our classrooms.
And it feels like coupling that culturally sustaining practice and what we know from that entire vein of research with what we understand from the science of reading is where we really need to go now, where you guys are going with this report. And we'll get, I think, into even more detail later about some of the tips that, what does this really look like when you're working with a 5-year-old or when you're working with a 6-year-old or even younger child, right? But it does feel like one of the overarching kind of themes is that we need to find a way to weave together these lines of research that are incredibly important, but haven't been necessarily talking to each other. Let me ask as well, and this maybe, should be for either of you, Diana or Erica. In the report, you also lay out the why. Why is it so important for us to get our hands around this and to do this well? And you lay out some of the, quite dismal statistics on reading that, people who have been coming to these webinars for years know quite well, but you don't shy at all away from pointing out that many of these, the differentials between students who are doing well in reading versus those who aren't, are based on racial identity. And you argue that it's past time to we really got to center the students' and our youngest children who have not been well served and who are Black and Latinx students that haven't been getting what they need when it comes to reading. Do you mind talking a little bit more about that and how that also relates to this broader idea of equitable learning, helping all students as well?
So I'll just briefly state that the data from the NAEP assessment, as you see, huge drops, and it was drops amongst all demographics. But unfortunately for Black and Latinx students, those drops were even greater, and it continues to widen the achievement gap for Black and Latinx students and their Caucasian peers. And it is vitally important that we actually have the research. We know the research about what works for children that are either in marginalized neighborhoods, Black and Latinx children. The thing that I think is very important for why the need for this report, this white paper was so important, is that we need to send the message that this is a very complex issue and that there aren't easy answers to implement the research that should be happening in our classrooms. I liken it to my son at a young age was diagnosed with cancer. And when we went to the hospital, there is a protocol on how to cure the specific cancer he had. But at the very beginning of the conversation, the doctor said to me, there are some issues that are that will impact your son's care. One, he's African-American, and he carries a specific gene that makes him highly susceptible, open to getting other diseases if we do a certain protocol. And therefore they made adjustments. They made a decision that here are the things that are best for this child. Now, that very same day, they could have gotten another child the same age, a different ethnicity, different background, and they had to make adjustments based on that because that was going to benefit my son. And today my son is a 34-year-old young man thriving. And it is that type of change that has to happen in our classrooms. And it is difficult when you have over 20 students who are coming to your room, all with very different backgrounds, different unique perspectives on life. And we believe that when you dig into the assets that children bring to the classroom and couple it with research and doing best practice, that is going to catapult our children. And then the third piece that the article briefly talks about is we have to also engage with their families. Their families come with unique backgrounds. And when you combine working with families, identifying best practices linked to research, and recognizing the differences that your children bring to the classroom, that's where we can really see the power come to fruition and really supporting, in the case of this particular article, Black and Brown children.
Diane, thank you for sharing. So incredibly, it's a powerful story. It's also a personal one, and I'm very glad to hear that that was years back, and things are much better for your son now. I know that offline that we all were talking about universal design for learning, and this point that you can do things that are focused on students that need certain supports, but in actuality, the best way to do that is to make sure that it's helping all students. Eric, I don't know if you wanted to describe a little bit more about that theory as well.
Sure. Thank you, Lisa. We focus a lot of our efforts on Black and Latinx children because they have been historically underserved in literacy education. If you run the numbers and the data across any assessments, across any context, we will see that they are adversely impacted because they face systemic barriers that limit access to high quality and culturally relevant instruction. And we believe that by centering our efforts on these children, we apply the principles of universal design for learning, which is designing instruction that meets the needs of those most marginalized. And we believe that that benefits all learners because a lot of those techniques and skills and are transferable and support every child. And this is really similar to the curb effect, where sidewalk ramps were designed for wheelchair access, but it also helped parents with strollers and travelers with luggage and workers with carts. And so we believe that when we create literacy practices that affirm and support Black and Latinx children, we're building a stronger, more inclusive system that uplifts every child. And so, we also believe that, to create truly effective and equitable literacy instruction, educators have to be intentional about how they choose and adapt their instructional materials. This means selecting resources that not only align with evidence-based literacy practices, but also reflect the diverse cultural backgrounds of their children and the communities that they serve. And so this means curating diverse and inclusive text that resonates with children and their identities and their lived experiences. It's key. And we believe that when children see themselves in what they read, it fosters greater engagement, deeper comprehension, and stronger connection to learning. And honestly, at the same time, it's essential to implement explicit and systematic reading instruction that's tailored to meet individual student needs, right? This includes incorporating culturally relevant examples and context to make learning meaningful and accessible for children. And I mentioned a bit earlier about the ongoing professional development. It's so critical and cannot be overstated. Educators have to continuously grow their skills in integrating the science of reading with culturally sustaining strategies and ensure that their practices are both research-driven and culturally responsive, and hoping to be able to bridge the gap between policies and theory and practice.
Yeah, and for both of you, I'm thinking about some of the folks who may be listening and watching today who are in contexts where, this sounds really like good, everything they want to hear, but they are at a point or in a classroom, or they're kind of feeling someone breathing down their neck about a certain way that they're supposed to be teaching reading in a certain amount of time. And to figure out how to weave in a lot of what you're describing, while also having, fidelity to whatever kind of the curriculum is put in front of them. I think that's a really big challenge for a lot of our teachers and our early childhood educators. Do you have some sort of thoughts around how they can get through that? And we can, I think this will be a theme throughout the next 30 minutes or so, but get us started on that.
I'll start by naming it's certainly a collaborative and collective effort. And I don't want to understate how important leaders' role is. Both school and systems leaders play in driving literacy success. To truly make an impact, leaders have to really articulate and model a clear vision that integrates both equity and the sciences of reading as foundational for student achievement. In our work, when we come and support school leaders and systems leaders, we start with the children, right? We observe the children and instruction, and we ask ourselves, what is happening, right, at the child layer, and what's going really well, and what do we want to be different? And we believe that whatever's happening at the child level is a direct result of teacher practice and teacher instruction. So if we want something to be different at the child layer, we have to support, coach, and develop the teachers. Well, the same thing exists for leaders, right? When we look at the teacher layer and we look at the practices that exist and don't exist, what's going well, opportunities for growth, it's a direct result of leader practices, right? And so we have to really look at our leaders' practices and think about, well, if we want this to change at the child layer, then we have to change this at the teacher layer. Well, what do we have to change as leaders, as school and systems leaders, in order to create the conditions for this to be true for teachers to change child practice? And so we really focus our work on coaching through the layers to create change, because all of us play a substantial role and responsibility in what we're seeing children do or not do in the classroom.
I also want to piggyback on Erica. You'll notice in the report, we do not talk about curriculum. We didn't, and when I say curriculum, resources. Because we're not here to say you should use this particular resource or that particular resource. What we're saying is that whatever resources your district is providing or your school provides, at the center, think about the children that you are educating. And if your classroom is diverse, ensure that the resources that you are utilizing represents them. And if they don't have representation of your diverse classroom, then part of what we do is help you look at other resources and materials that are probably in your library, somewhere in your school building, that will help you access ways of teaching children that are diverse, that represent them, and help them see themselves in the text that you are using in your classroom.
Yeah, interesting. And I'm looking forward to kind of digging more into those kinds of resources and representative texts and things like that. And what I want to do now actually is we're going to move into a discussion with our other panelists, but don't go anywhere because I want to pull you back in, especially when we get back to some of these strategies and tips and tricks. And so you've already have been laying out several of them for us. So why don't I do this? And before I do go to our next panelists who are going to be reflecting on the report with us, I just want to note that the point about leaders was a beautiful tie-in and tee up to one of the next GLR sessions. I think it's next week. I might be wrong on that, but I know that they're going to be focusing on principles in pre-K through third and P3 settings soon. And these are exactly the kinds of things those leaders need to know. So thank you so much, Diana and Erica, and for the report and for bringing, really bringing these issues out in a salient way. So why don't I do this? I'm going to ask if our other panelists, Anya and Sigrid, can join us now to continue this discussion. Good to see you both. It's really quite an honor to be with so many fantastic kind of researchers and thinkers in this space. And you guys are right there. So we're thrilled to be with you today. Why don't I start by having each of you just take a minute or two to introduce yourselves just a little bit more on how you relate to these issues of equitable literacy instruction and the work that you do. And then I'll have some more specific questions for you. So if I could ask Anya, maybe you to go first.
Wonderful. Thank you. It's an honor to be a part of this panel and to join the campaign for grade level reading community once again for this important discussion. So SEAL is a research and evidence-based approach to joyful, rigorous, equity-focused education. We do this work because we believe in the cultural, linguistic, intellectual brilliance of our country's diverse children. And we very deeply understand that our schools are not adequately designed to serve these diverse children. We know that when schooling builds upon the assets, the lived experiences, the funds of knowledge, honoring family and community cultures, and developing home languages, children thrive. Even though this is widely agreed upon in much of the research, as we've been discussing already, and more generally agreed upon in much of the education sector, it flies in the face of what so many children experience each and every day. So at SEAL, we work to make asset-based, engaging, joyful learning a very real experience for children, families, and school communities. And we work to move English learners from the margins to the center of our approaches, policies, and practices. So all that to say, SEAL's work is very deeply aligned with this report and the work of the Children's Literacy Initiative. I love the report, how the report uplifts the pendulum swings that are continual within education, and that those swings and that as those swings occur, we often disregard and throw away the aspects of the previous reform without analyzing what were the promising elements. I love the 5 myths and truths that Erica went through earlier. They're so powerful. And throughout those myths and truths, there's an important thread related to this complexity, the complexity of literacy, the complexity of learning, and the complexity of historically rooted injustices that are being overlooked and in some instances denied and replaced with reductivist, oversimplistic frameworks and practices. Learning is fundamentally a social and cultural process that exists within historical contexts. This is not new knowledge, right? Many cite Vygotsky, but of course, this knowledge is reflected in many different traditions and cultures and knowledge bases and histories. Learning is complex and dynamic. When we notice a particular movement or initiative, educational fad that is narrow and that simplifies the problem, we have to resist the age-old tendency to latch onto it. That does not mean that there's no truth or that there's nothing real in the initiative. The way the science of reading has taken root has multiple causes and reasons. But one is that many teachers are asking for more guidance on how to teach decoding and how to teach different types of children how to decode. This is an outcome of that pendulum swing that the report is uplifting. In some places and in some curricula, the implementation of Common Core as a response to No Child Left Behind minimized decoding instruction. Nonetheless, that is not an excuse to now become overly focused on decoding, which is a very real historic tendency within education. Furthermore, we must resist the tendency to focus our decoding instruction and curriculum on only English, treating children as if they are all English speakers and ignoring their assets, their strengths, and the promises of multilingual education. As Erica and Diana point out, the literacy crisis is much bigger, wider, and has historical roots that go much deeper than can be simply solved by programs and products that label themselves the science of reading. As they point out, the research and the knowledge about literacy is complex and evolving, and reducing the literacy crisis to an issue that is only about decoding is deeply flawed. Literacy is multifaceted, and we need comprehensive approaches that center the children, their communities, their histories, and their assets. Lastly, I so deeply respect and appreciate how the report points out the problematic tendency to give teachers a script, to give teachers curricula and programs to follow with fidelity, when the research and science shows us over and over that teachers want, deserve, and need to be treated as professionals and be provided professional learning systems and professional practices that treat their job with respect for how complex and truly multifaceted it is.
So thank you, Anya. Sorry, Anya. I'm gonna come back to a couple of things that you said in a moment, but let me go over to you, Sigrid, and just hear a little bit more on your background and your connection to this issue.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's such an honor to be part of this conversation. And I'll start with my personal experience to this topic. I'm not gonna lie, ever since I realized I was part of this conversation, I've been crying. I'm a crier, and I'm gonna explain why. I came to the United States from Puerto Rico when I was 11 years old. At that time, I moved to Florida and I didn't have any support to learn English. I went to a middle school that was on the first year of its operation. No ESOL teacher ever came to me, which I now realize it's against the law. And I was accidentally placed in special education because I was considered mute. And I'm sorry, friends, I'm not mute. You'll find this out real soon. And I taught myself to learn English. I was literate in Spanish, no support in English, and I was very motivated to learn English. So what I did is I would go to school, to my school library in the morning before school started, and I taught myself to read. I taught myself to read really easy things at first, like Dr. Seuss, etc. And I worked my way up, and I'm a fighter. And I told myself that, well, I prayed, and then I told myself, if I can learn English, I promise I'm going to teach other children how to learn English. So that's part of my story. The other part of my story is that I didn't grow up in the right side of town. I grew up in the town where it was a Black and Latino town area of Tampa. I saw some people from St. Petersburg, so I'm excited that my neighbors are here. And I was basically kind of left to my own resources. I had to figure it out. It was very difficult. But because I'm a fighter, I figure it out, as I oftentimes do, as our Black and Latino children oftentimes do. But I really sacrificed my identity in the process. So I learned English and I became the first person in my family to go to college and do all the right things, I guess, which is something to be proud of. But then I wasn't proud of my identity. I wasn't proud of speaking Spanish, and I definitely wasn't proud of the way I sounded. I didn't want anybody to know that I spoke like Bad Bunny, even though now I use it as a sign of pride. And all that to say that the reason I care so much about this work in terms of the policies, the practices, the technical assistance, et cetera, is that this idea of like, what are we trying to sustain in culturally and linguistically sustaining instruction is like children's heart and humanity. The idea that when children come to school, to love a child fully means that I'm going to love their linguistic varieties, I'm going to love their languages, and I'm going to love who they are. And we're not going to do to children like my teacher in high school did to me when I asked her, how come Puerto Rico's not mentioned in this class? And she told me, Puerto Ricans have never done anything worthy that needs to be included in the history books. But Bunny begs to differ. And I beg to differ, right? And the reason that I'm mentioning Bad Bunny, it's to be funny, but also like it's because it's this idea that when we allow children to show up authentically as themselves, we provide them with a tool to love themselves, and that's the biggest legacy. I learned to read in school, but I learned to love myself despite of school, and I think that's what really brings me to this work. So thank you again.
Sigrid, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And I want to note that, there have been some questions in the chat, and we'll get to some of these too, around just, well, what are the barriers? Let's name them. Let's talk about like, what is it that we're trying to get over? You've just helped us see and understand that. And I think as being as specific as possible, what this means to children's motivations to want to be learners, is part of understanding how the science of reading should be applied as much as the other instructional pieces, which are so key. And I'll just reiterate what was said at the top. And I know, Anya, you agree, and I'll maybe ask you to explain this a little bit more, but this is a conversation that's not at all about saying there shouldn't be decoding. Like, absolutely, students need to learn in very direct instructional oriented ways in most cases, decoding and phonics and phonemic awareness and fluency and a lot of those pieces for sure. So let me ask you, maybe going to you, Anya, to unpack this a little bit more, in particular for those of our young learners who have a different language at home, who are multilingual already and are learning in a space where they're hearing 2 or sometimes 3 languages. Why is it important number? I mean, this is kind of a very basic question, but why do we need to make sure we're including them in our conversation? And then what are some of the pieces of the science of reading that need to be applied in their cases, more specific ways?
Yeah, so I think, well, I first want to also voice my appreciation for Sigrid sharing her story. So appreciate that. And, I think what it illuminates is her success in so many ways was despite school, right? And so we're really taking that step back and saying, how are we designing our schools? Because we are never going to get whole population to achieve at high levels, to leave no child left behind when our schools are designed in the ways that she was describing. And so this idea of really welcoming children's languages, welcoming who they are, having them reflected in their classroom, in their curriculum, in the books, as Erica and Deanna were sharing, is so critical. And also leveraging that home language. So kids, and I also wanted to just kind of underscore Sigrid's point about being labeled mute. So many teachers will say, and with very good intentions, but these kids have no language. They have no language. Well, that's not true at all. And anybody who's ever tried to learn a second language knows that when you are being exposed to a new language, you are often in a very receptive mode. You are often really trying to comprehend and understand what's happening, and that your productive skills come after your receptive skills. And so because children are quiet does not mean that they don't have language by any means. So recognizing that children do have language, and that there are assets in those languages, and that we need to attend to what they know, then we need to attend and point out the differences. English is a really complicated language. It is actually one of the harder languages to learn how to read in specifically. It's part of why there's more occurrences of dyslexia in the English language than in Spanish particularly, and I believe even German. So, really understanding children's home languages. So teachers actually doing some research, and that's a big ask, again, to this point about why we need to professionalize teachers. We see classrooms where there are 10 different languages being spoken. Well, teachers have to understand something about those languages, both in welcoming them, in asking parents to share some songs and stories and come in and speak. I mean, all of those pieces, but also to help understand, as those kids are applying their multilingualism, what are ways that they should be understanding the differences and the similarities within those languages. So it's just so critical. There's lots of harm that's done when children are not welcomed, when they, as again, Sigrid's story illuminates so beautifully. And so we have to be building schools and giving teachers the tools and resources and the time, because those kids change and those languages change, communities change. Even within the Spanish-speaking world, there's lots of differences, right? And so we have to create that space so teachers can really understand who their kids are, reflect who their kids are, address and identify and design their pedagogy appropriately.
Yes, Anya, and I feel like maybe you've set Sigrid up quite well, because I know I wanted to get to Sigrid, something that you showed when we were prepping for this, a slide that you have that helps to explain what your research has shown when it comes to supporting multilingual learners. And maybe if I can see if Emily or others can share that while you describe a little bit more of what you've been finding.
Thank you. I think just to kind of take a step back and kind of get at that really concrete question that people ask, specifically people that are experts in bilingualism, that have pause about the science of reading. So the question is, does the science of reading reflect multilingual children? Does it reflect Black children who speak Black English or Black language, or any child, right, who may speak in a way that's different than general American English? So I like to show pictures, so let's talk about it for a second. So in terms of multilingual children, but this also expands to any child who's speaking something other than general American English, or something in addition to general American English. And what I mean by that, that's usually the English that we're going to experience in schools. Historically, someone asked about historical barriers. Well, one barrier is that our education system in the United States has been based on the cultural and linguistic norms of white monolingual children and adults from middle to upper class. It's the language that you're going to oftentimes hear in books, see in books, see in news. It's usually the language that is perceived as having a higher prestige, right? Like if you want to sound professional or academic, that's usually the type of language variety that is held at a higher point, right? And so naturally, people are going to worry that a science of reading approach is going to dehumanize, or not even dehumanize, but just kind of put it at a lower level, right? Other languages, other language varieties. So kind of bringing that into this idea of the science of reading. First, the science of reading research has been conducted for the last 50 years across different countries in different contexts. And we know that children need those two main things to become really good readers. They need to be able to decode, which in some languages like English and Spanish, that means understand the alphabetic principle. And in other languages, it could mean understanding script, right? But it's this idea of like, you see something and you have to interpret it. That's the decoding piece of it. A lot of us focus on just the phonics or the decoding, right? But there's another part. We need to be able to understand what we read and to make meaning of what we read. You need both to become like a really good reader. And so this idea of what does this look like for multilingual children, and children that speak different language varieties, the good news is that it looks similar. It's not that different, but there is some things that we need to consider. So this figure here explains that for children that are multilingual in particular, children need to be able to understand what reading looks like in one language. They need to understand what reading looks like in a different language. And an ideal situation, we'll be able to link these things together for children to become biliterate. And one thing that I think is so valid, right, from advocates is that they worry that the focus on phonics only is taken away from oral language, which is critical. Like, we cannot expect kids to decode if we're not supporting their oral language development in both decoding and language comprehension activities, right? And so oral language development, as you'll see in this figure, is central. So that means that a really skilled teacher would know how to embed oral language instruction within phonics, right? So we would practice speaking and listening and building, for example, that English and that other language as well. So that key really, how do we maintain a focus on biliteracy and bilingualism, and really at the core of everything. Sorry, my dog decides to talk right now, of course. It's oral language. So I'll pause here so my dog can calm down, but this is a really important concept.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Sigrid. And I totally get that with the, the dog barking. But that was that's a helpful graphic and framework. I wonder, Anya, just kind of off the cuff here, I'd be curious to bring in some of these questions around oral language back to some of what you were saying as well. And let me try to pull a couple of pieces together and tell me if this is like, if I'm off here. I mean, so we have situations where there are children at home who are they're expressive in the language of their home, and they're learning how to express themselves. They're learning comprehension and meaning at home in this language that is not English. They have parents or aunts or uncles or others that are speaking these languages around them. They're hearing that, getting a lot of meaning and understanding from that. Then they're in pre-K classroom or kindergarten classroom, and there is, well, number one, right, there's 20 kids and they're being told to zip their lip, and then, they're not supposed to be talking in a lot of cases. And then the other is that there's sometimes like many different languages that they're hearing around them, because these are classrooms with, it may not just be Spanish, but it also may be Vietnamese or other languages in their classroom. And then they have a teacher who has to be hitting certain, test scores, accountability measures on English reading, being able to read a text in English, maybe even being able to speak out loud in English. How does that oral language piece help and support the growth of their literacy across English and in their other languages as well? Do you mind just helping us?
Absolutely.
That thread?
So again, I think anybody who's tried to learn a second language knows that you can't learn the language unless you use the language and speak the language, or it's going to be much, much more difficult. So for children, that's absolutely essential. Children's brains are wired for language. So the whole idea that don't let them hear other languages. I mean, if they're in a classroom with 10 or 12 other languages, that's wonderful. They will pick up much more than the adults in the room will pick up. That's what their brains are wired for. So we have to just realize that, and in one of the chats, somebody was talking about the issue of superiority. 100%. We have linguistic superiority in this country, right? And that has evolved over time. In the early years of this country, there was a lot of room for linguistic diversity of European languages, when of course we know that non-European languages were used as tools of oppression, or stripped from communities. So language and the acceptance of language has evolved, and it's really in World War I and xenophobia that English became this main focus. So we've been carrying this history with us for a long time, this idea that, oh, it's all about English and only English. That is not what the world reflects. You know, many countries and communities speak many languages. So we have to reject that concept and then create scaffolds for children to use language, to hear language, but then to use language. And so that can be done in lots of different ways. That can be done through chants and choral response. Along the way, there has to be comprehensible input so that the words that are being generated aren't just sounds, but actually begin to have meaning, right? And so that means pictures and the stories and re-engaging concepts, not simplistically by any means, because again, our brains are wired for this. Kids will, you know, a 3-year-old will work as hard as possible to say a 5-syllable word. Like, they're not scared of trying. So we should not be minimizing and simplifying our language, whether or not they say it perfectly the first time. So creating that oral language opportunities, scaffolds along the way. If they use their home language, celebrating it. Okay, so we absolutely cannot tell children it's wrong. If they use their own dialect, celebrating it, that's not wrong. That's actually linguistic brilliance. They are likely translating for their own comprehension the language that they're hearing in school and making meaning for it themselves. That being said, we still model for them the language of school, right? We're not denying children access to academic language. Of course not. That's opportunity. But meanwhile, we're developing, celebrating, and, you know, very much so, I think it was said earlier, this yes and rather than this either or framework, right? An abundance framework is absolutely what's critical in our classrooms. You know, kids, without that abundance framework, kids within weeks, when their language is not represented and not welcomed, within weeks, they begin not responding to their own parents, their aunties, their grandparents, their siblings in their home language. They internalize that very, very quickly. That school, the right language, the right, you know, the way to be a good student is to speak English. And so they internalize that very quickly. What that means is their language loss is happening that quickly. That's harmful, right? There's all sorts of research that speaks to that. And we're denying them bilingualism, multilingualism, and biliteracy, which of course that literacy in multiple languages is what we really need to be aiming towards.
Yeah, that really, thank you, Anya. And I just think about, I have many friends of my generation, you know, in mid-50s, who lost their first language. And it was something that they were told not to, you know, we don't speak it anymore. And it's just such a heartbreak. And so we've got to find a way to make sure that it is absolutely this both and. If I could, and we're gonna be bringing Diana and Erica back in a moment here too, because I really do want to. Well, I've got some good questions in the Q&A. Want to make sure that we all have a chance to answer, and I also want to get into some of the specifics for our principals and our teachers in the classroom and our early childhood educators in whatever setting, so that they can have something to kind of take back with them. So let me ask about so we're talking about the oral language and how important that is. We still have this important issue of having children being able to read texts. Especially, I think, Anya, it's so important that you noted we absolutely academic language is crucial in the school settings, and so to be succeeding in school today, that means getting to a point, maybe it's by the time you're in 3rd grade, maybe it's a few years after that, where you are reading texts in English. If you're lucky enough to be in a place where it's you have other languages too, you're reading texts in other languages. So what, and maybe both of you could provide some of these kind of strategies and tips for us, but what can you offer for teachers who are feeling the pressure of getting their students to that point of being able to read a passage. Okay, it's going to be on the test in 3rd grade and they need to read this and it's going to be in English. What should they be doing? And maybe if we could even space it out, like in those 4 and 5-year-old age levels, and then by 6 and 7.
I'd like to get started by first just kind of summarizing and grounding us on research, a concept, and then promise you we'll get to strategies with a focus on monolingual providers, or what I like to call linguistically unmatched, because you can be bilingual and still not be matched to the children you work with, of course. So just real quick, what does research say helps children learn English faster and become biliterate? Dual language instruction. So we talk about access, equitable reasons why children aren't doing well at a systems level. A systems level issue is that we focus on English only instruction and English only assessments. And really research says that what we need to do is invest in, expand, and scale up dual language education. To me, that's an equity issue. And of course, dual language education aligned with a biliterate science of reading. That's the dream, right? We live in reality. So what is reality? Reality is that the second thing we can do when dual language education is not accessible to us is we can at least embed the home language. And there's different ways to do that. And this is where I might get in trouble. So embedding the home language for me needs to go beyond putting a poster that says, hola, bienvenido, like Jambo. That's cute, but that's not meaningful to me, right? Meaningful to me means that it's well planned out. I'm going to share really specific strategies of how to do that, but it needs to be done in a way that it builds that oral language and it builds that literacy, decoding, writing, comprehension, all of it needs to expand children's linguistic repertoires. That's my concept. So I'm going to share my concept because that's one thing I would love for people to get from this. A linguistic repertoire is everything that people know across languages, language varieties, and non-spoken modalities to understand the world and to make meaning. So here's an analogy. A white monolingual child might have general American English in their proverbial backpack. They bring that to school and their reading instruction is going to match that same what's in their backpack. So easy does it, right? That's good. But what about a child who is Latine, right? What if in their little backpack, their linguistic repertoire has some English, maybe not a lot, Spanish, a specific kind of Spanish, like maybe it's Mexican Spanish, and non-spoken communication. Now, instruction, the books that are selected, the language that's used is only pulling from English, right? And what happens to that linguistic repertoire? We're missing a whole bunch of resources the child has, but we're not making it known to them, right? And so when we do English only, because we're like, I don't speak part of their linguistic repertoire, we're doing a huge disservice. Same thing for Black children. Not all Black children speak Black language, but some do. And Black language is not an inferior version of general American English, right? It's not an improper, it's a rule-governed, systematic way of speaking that's also valid, right? And so in their linguistic backpack, right, they're gonna have general American English and Black language and non-spoken modalities. So our instruction has to support that linguistic repertoire. Here's the strategies, I promise. The first thing that we need to do is understand what is in children's backpacks, what is in their linguistic repertoire. Like if we don't even know, you can't support it. Learning. Google is our friend. So I, for example, have supported children that speak Mandarin. I don't know anything about Mandarin, but I know how to Google. And so when you Google, please write this down. This is what you're going to Google. Google, how do children learn to read in Mandarin? How does it differ from English? And then you're going to look at this. You're going to look, what are the sounds that are the same across the languages? That's going to help you with decoding. And what is the grammatical structure, the way the sentences are formed, the morphology? Like we need to understand all parts of language because that's going to make you really good at teaching. You need to understand language in order to support children to acquire the oral language that they need in order to become strong readers. So here's an example. So first, write this down, learn about the language, Google. Second thing is start identifying the things that are the same across the languages and start there. So for a preschooler, let's say they speak Spanish and English. Well, we know that there's sounds that are the same. So I would teach those sounds first, and there's sounds that sound different. So then you teach those, right? Because you want to make cross-linguistic connections. And you can say something simple, like you can practice, put in a post-it, use Google and say the letter A in English is, A, it makes it sound ah. In Spanish, it makes the sound ah, and keep going. But that small connection, that cross-linguistic connection is what's going to help build that leverage. The third thing is making sure that books and the learning environment reflect the linguistic repertoires of the children. So for example, like having books that are in different languages that the children speak, in different language varieties. And we know not all languages are written, and we'll figure that out when we do our research, right? So valuing like recording stories, using video, or talking to parents so they record stories, making books for their own kids in all their linguistic repertoire. That's another way to build children's, development of their reading. And the last thing I'll say is helping children or encouraging children to use their linguistic repertoire, their entire linguistic repertoire, to understand English or what's happening. So you may not speak a different language, but if you are teaching a vocabulary word, you can encourage the child, draw a picture, write the definition in your home language. Let me help you with the English. So now you're using everything in children's backpacks to help them become strong readers and really, and sustaining, right? Going back to that you're sustaining their language and culture without you speaking it. So we'll put some resources for you all that explain that in much depth, but that's really the key. Don't be a gatekeeper for linguistic repertoire. Really open it up and make sure that children's entire backpack is used for building their literacy.
That's so great. Can I build from Sigrid's examples? Yes. Thank you. So well spoken. I want to also just really talk about this concept of integration, integrating all the elements of literacy, right? And one of the real issues, and I think we've noted this already, but with the science of reading is it talks about reading, it makes reading sound like it happens in a vacuum, when in fact, as we've been saying, it doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? There's speaking, listening, reading, and writing, and those are all interconnected, and they develop in interconnected ways. And so I want to just put the plug in for writing. And all the pre-writing, right, that Sigrid was just talking about, the drawing and telling your story. And of course, that's dictation when kiddos are little. And that when they do that dictation in their home language, that's celebrated. That's not, translated immediately or corrected, right? So again, thinking about that yes and mindset and really applying it as best as possible. Lots of kids really study foundational skills in phonics because they want to be writers. They are excited to write and tell their stories, right? And so, and of course, their stories need to be their own stories, their stories of their lives, their families, their communities. So bringing that in, making sure that then the modeled reading and the share alouds and the stories that are connection points for their own stories, of course, while also building on their innate curiosity. And so I also want to talk about the integration of content and the importance of making everything that's happening in the classroom interesting and learning. And so another piece that we see in the implementation of the science of reading is these long blocks of kind of very hyper-focused, we sometimes call it drill and kill phonics and foundational skills, that's disconnected from the juicy, interesting, exciting things. Kids are natural scientists. They're natural social scientists. We all have had those kids or our own children who ask those questions that you're like, shh, you're not supposed to say that right now, because they're trying to understand the world and they have that natural curiosity. And so it's so critical that we are integrating all of our instruction within science, social studies, along with math and literacy, that we are really honoring that. That's what kids are certainly wired for. It's what they want to learn. Those languages have their own domains. So unless you're raised by scientists, none of us speak the language of science innately. And so those languages have their own domains, and 3-year-olds want to understand it and use the words, the big, fancy words, metamorphosis, when you're learning about butterflies and observing them in your classroom. So really making those opportunities and linking the decoding instruction and the foundational skills within that learning, because then they're motivated. And that's what we want. We want it all to come together, right? So that, yes, we need structured time to teach these foundational skills, but we need to integrate that structured time into everything else that's happening, and we need to do it in the appropriate size chunks. One of the pieces that worries me so much is that I see very little discussion in the science of reading kind of trend around reading first and the No Child Left Behind error and what went so deeply wrong there. The data is very clear that there was no statistically significant outcomes on reading comprehension within reading first. That's what the federal government research tells us. Billions of dollars sunk into that very, very hyper-focused decoding initiative. And so it's not that there wasn't research and science behind reading first, but the implementation of it was so problematic, and what happened to so many classrooms and teachers and curriculum and so forth. And we're not looking at that. We're not mining that for what went wrong and how do we really make sure that doesn't happen within this current fad and this current kind of movement in terms of where we see things going.
Yeah. Oh, thank you, both of you. Anya provided, I think, some real kind of concrete and specific examples for us. And I'll just, I wanted to kind of put a big circle around that content-rich reading and writing and the full literacy experience that children need. So when I was working on the book Tap, Click, Read about using technology and early literacy, we were really zooming in on how much learning science and social studies and art and history and story can come within the same time period that you're teaching phonics and decoding. That integration, Anya, is so captivating and exciting for children, and is not vapid and boring and completely killing all their motivation to learn. But it's not easy to do that integration, and doing it in ways that are recognizing different cultures and understanding where students' background comes from does just take some real time and care. Let me bring Diana and Erica back in if I can, because I did want. I'm gonna note a couple of the questions. We've touched on some of them already, but some really good questions have come into the Q&A, and I want to make sure we have time to get to some of those, as well as to, I just want to ask our audience if there are any other kind of questions you have that are specific to the instruction that you've been asked to give in your classroom and how you can modify it. Please put those in there, because we want this to be as helpful on the ground as possible for so many of you. So Diana and Erica, I would love to, of course, hear your reflections on some of this conversation, how it relates to the CLI report. But if I could just also zoom back in on your points about the materials that are in front of our young ones, and what it means for them to be able to see themselves and others in those texts, because we did get a question about using instructional and student materials that pictorially or thematically represent diverse students. And if we can just, let's tease that out a little bit more so that there's an understanding of what that might mean for teachers. And I know that a lot of this comes from the work on windows and mirrors and sliding doors, and we've done some work on that at New America too. But I do think it will help to have some concrete examples of how to do that in your classrooms. So I'll throw that back to you guys.
Go first.
Well, thank you so much for that question. And as Dr. Green mentioned, we are curriculum agnostic as an organization, so we don't promote a specific curriculum. We do believe that it is important for the curriculum to reflect the diversity of the children that it's serving. And it is incredibly important to just note that the curriculum that anyone uses in their classrooms is culturally responsive to a group of children. The question that we have to ask ourselves is it culturally responsive to the children that I am serving, right? And, as we have done a lot of work at Children's Literacy Initiative around reviewing instructional materials, reviewing books to ensure that they are culturally responsive and reflective of different children and populations and communities, we actually found some texts that affirmed negative stereotypes, right? And the reality is that folks who create curriculum, folks who create books are also humans, as we all are, and bring our own biases to the table and our own beliefs to the table. And we're all breathing in what Dr. Beverly Tatum calls the smog, right, that persists here, in particularly the United States, around particular demographics and groups of people. And we would be remiss if we did not acknowledge that. And one of the books that we came across several years ago for small group instruction had a white police officer and a Black child, and that police officer arresting that Black child. And that was a book that children were engaging in small group instruction, right? And so you can imagine some of the challenges that we experienced with that text. And, we don't believe that it's intentional for anyone to do these things. We believe that everyone comes to this space as an educator with the best of intentions, wanting to serve children. It's one of the most noble professions. And this is coming from a child of a Chicago public school teacher who just retired 3 years ago, right? I believe profoundly in the power of our teachers and our educators. And we also have to be open to analyze our beliefs and our practices and how it's impacting children in the classroom, because those, even our most well-intentioned actions can have decades and a lifetime of trauma for children. I don't know if anyone's has read Dr. Claude Steele's Stereotype Threat. He's a Stanford professor who, wrote a book called Whistling Vivaldi, and he was speaking about being a student at the University of Chicago here. And he's a Black man, and as he walked down the street at night, he would whistle Vivaldi so that folks knew and believed that he wasn't a threat, right? And it's so important to know one of his studies that he had done was with a group of white participants and a group of Black participants, and it was white men and Black men, and he had them both play a golf game. And he said, when he named for the participants, well, this is a measure of your athleticism, right? When the Black group played the game, they outperformed the white group. When he said to both groups, this is actually a measure of your intellectual capability and your strategy, right? Then the white group outperformed the Black group. And he said that it's because we have, again, smog that we're all breathing in about our abilities, what we can and can't do. And it impacts how we perform in any space, whether that's our career, whether that's in the classroom, whether that's in our relationships. And it's just so important to understand how all of these pieces fit together and how it impacts both children and their experiences in the classroom, the teachers who are serving the children, the leaders who are in the buildings. So it just felt really important to name that. Curriculum materials are incredibly important because it will either affirm identities or it will affirm negative stereotypes and beliefs about children that we're serving in the communities that we are operating within.
Yes, thank you, Erica, for just really being specific there and naming that, and that book's incredibly valuable for so many of us. Let me get to a couple of more of the questions.
Can I just want to add something to that, because I'm seeing some things in the chat. I think it's very important that everyone understand, someone already said it, it's not either or.
Yep.
It's and. We do need to teach foundational skills. It's vital that we teach foundational skills, but we need to not do it to the neglect of other connections that help all children become proficient readers. I think it was Anya who talked about connecting all the content. When you are choosing to do, if you do a read aloud in your classroom, don't make it in isolation. Connect that read aloud to the foundational skills that you taught that morning. And there are diverse decodables. I did a class observation, and the teacher was using the book, a second grade classroom, and the book was called I Love My Nappy Hair. Her class was very diverse. She did that read aloud, but the very next 30 minutes, the children were in small group. And she had a decodable that talks about we all have different types of hair. So she connected the foundational lesson she did earlier to the read aloud, to the actual practice of foundational skills. That is what we're talking about. Make it connected. The next day, she moved on to something in social studies related to going to, because this is second grade, going to your community barbershop. Now, that is truly using the sciences of reading and weaving in culturally relevant pedagogy. And that's what we're talking about. It's not an either or, because I'm seeing things in the chat. No, we believe that foundational skills is very important, but oral language is very important in recognizing the linguistic excellence and brilliance of each and every child, recognizing the things that they bring to the table and figuring out, how do I connect all of this? We said it was complex. And there is no doubt about it. It's not easy because we're not dealing with just one child. You have over 20 children in your classroom. So I'm sorry, I just wanted to re-emphasize that it's finding those threads of connectiveness and figuring out how you can weave it all together. It's like the Scarborough's rope. The Scarborough rope, and all we're saying is there's a thread of culturally relevance that needs to also weave into that Scarborough's rope.
And can be a help to all students.
Yes.
All students, even our more general, white kids, like they all need it. Let me point out that there's some really good Q&As that are kind of getting in at like just very practical stuff, like, do teachers have time? How do we do this when there hasn't been good professional development? What if our teachers are all monolingual from the beginning? And so I know that we are starting to ourselves run out of time. We've got 5 minutes or so to try to tackle some of these, but I think we really are starting to get to the crux of the issues in terms of just recognizing that this is complex, but it is also doable, but will take some strategy. And I'm hearing some really good ideas and strategies. Let me maybe just, if I could open it up to all four of you in terms of responding to this, how do we do this work when the majority of our teachers are monolingual and don't have any kind of background in any of this, when they're not, and they're maybe purposefully not being taught any kind of diversity, equity, inclusion ways of thinking around this, when they have to be really careful about some of that. Do you have some ideas for them?
I'm happy to jump in and then pass it along to my colleagues. So language is the vehicle of all learning. So the more that we all understand language and different kinds of language, the stronger our classrooms are going to be. And absolutely monolingual people can learn about language, learn about other languages, learn about how language works, scaffold language instruction in and throughout everything. So this is definitely, again, a yes and approach. This is not, you have to be multilingual yourself to be a strong educator by any means. That being said, most people code switch and dialect switch in some ways or another. So we actually do think about language, not just in a monolithic way. And so understanding that and spending some time learning about that, there's no question, as the report points out, as I've said earlier, as Sigrid, I mean, we're not creating an infrastructure for most teachers to do the very complex work that they need to do. So that is just the truth of the matter. And to our policymakers and our education leaders and our principals and administrators, the more that you can create time and space for your teachers to scaffold, to learn, to do PD on language and language development, to spend time researching the languages of their communities, of their children, the more you can find the experts in your community. Certainly several of us do that work. That's what our organizations exist to do, is to support schools and districts and programs and teachers to learn and to develop this PD. So, that's absolutely critical. In California, we have this concept of integrated and designated English language development, and in our dual classrooms, we'll say Spanish language development as well, integrated, designated, but that integrated is absolutely supports all students. When we scaffold language, we're supporting all students to thrive and to go deeper. And I just want to add in this concept, you know, we in our work, we focus a lot on language functions. That's a lot of the tier 2 language that we use. So we have the you know, the academic vocabulary, but the language of sequencing, the language of description, the language of cause and effect, that language function that sits within a story, as Diana's describing, within a content area, let's say a unit on, you know, cells or on insects. You find what is the language function that's going to, and then you start to scaffold that language function so that kids can get ever more, you know, yes, academic, but we say rich, beautiful, precise with their language.
I just want to jump in really quick. This is such an incredible discussion. As you guys have seen, thank you for those of you who are have already completed it. We've posted our poll, and I can't tell you how seriously we take your feedback. So please take a minute as you are continuing to listen to our awesome speakers as they wrap this up. But please take a minute to do our poll, complete our poll.
I want to add that kind of to the point of the question, like what infrastructure is needed. I just put a recent report on dual language immersion and thinking through the different components. I know it's dual language immersion, but the thought process is the same, right? It's not fair to put all the onus on teachers when the system doesn't change, right? And so we need administrative buy-in and knowledge. They need to understand this information as well and really be strong proponents of multilingualism, multiculturalism, even if they don't speak the language or are part of that community. We need data that's disaggregated by demographic materials. And in the world that we live in, you know, the Named Children's Equity Project is coming under attack, right? But for me, I change it. What if it's like just looking at the data, right? As educators, we all care about all children. And if the data says these children are not doing well, then there needs to be strategic planning that thinks about every aspect of schooling and supports for children, right? Looking at it that way. And then I changed the word equity to this is best for, because that's at the heart of it, right? So dual language education is best for emergent bilinguals. That's what the research doesn't lie. Including children's cultures and identities in their learning environment is best for, and that's the way we get to it. But that has to really impact from the top down, professional development, data, hiring decisions. All these things can exist even in really tough political times where it's like a cuss word to say certain things. Those things don't change, right? It's good instruction. If it works for certain children, it's going to work for all children. So I just think like thinking of family engagement and leadership, thinking about children with disabilities that also have intersecting racial and linguistic identities, it's all relevant to reading outcomes. And we need to kind of understand it from a system level and while also supporting teachers.
Yes, the supporting teachers part seems to be just it keeps coming through, and how much more teacher training and professional development, but also time and space and a recognition of their professional growth is key to this with their principals and with their superintendents. With the very few couple of minutes that we have left, let me just ask kind of a wide open question of the four of you, and you can give even a 1 or 2 word answer, but given this conversation, given where we are with the science of reading and the evolution and deeper understanding of it that I think has been captured so beautifully here, what are your hopes for the next 2 to 3 years of literacy instruction? What's giving you hope?
I think the number of participants on this webinar gives me hope, because obviously it was a topic that drew this number of individuals because they are craving for support. I think Erica said it, no one shows up to teach each and every day to do a poor job, but we pour down policy, and then from leadership, we send down requirements and say things like implement with fidelity. It's the support that teachers are asking for, that teachers say, I'm a professional, I can do what's best for my students, but sometimes I need support. Through Children's Literacy Initiative, that's what that's what we desire. We want to support educators by providing coaching, professional development, providing that linkage between teachers and families. Everyone wants what's best for children. It's now time for us to come together, collaborate, figure out what's best for your children, develop that strategic plan that needs to tell you the roadmap, and then implement. And that's what I feel like I see from what's in the chat and the number of people on this webinar.
And the thing that I'll just add is my hope and dream would be a huge investment in terms of dollars and resources for professional development for both teachers and leaders, right? And systems and structures that create space for professional learning, getting the opportunity to read some of the research, engage with the ideas, try out some of these practices in a low stakes environment. We just believe with high levels of expectation come high levels of support. And, people are hungry and thirsty for the knowledge and the ability to practice, and everyone wants to do, as Dr. Green said, great work. And it's time to make sure that the supports and the resources are in place to be able to do that.
I'm just going to jump in here because I know we have 1 minute left, and I'm going to tell everybody, if you didn't see my post in the chat has been incredibly robust today. So we are going to commit to downloading that and making that one of the resources that we share with all of you. But I cannot say thank you enough to this awesome panel. And Lisa, your brilliant, brilliant moderation, making sure we heard from everybody. I thank you so much, Sigrid and Anya, for those, and everybody, Diana and Erica, for this really specific guidance. It's just so, so, so helpful.